Birth of the Death World. In a distant corner of the galaxy, far from the bustling trade routes and gleaming cities of advanced civilizations, there lay a world unlike any other. Its name was Terramorth, a fusion of Earth and Death, and it earned its title for good reason. This was a planet of extremes, a crucible where survival was a daily battle against relentless forces. Its gravity was punishingly strong, storms raged with unrelenting fury, and the predators that roamed its jungles seemed born from the darkest nightmares. When spacefaring explorers first discovered the planet, they assumed it would be lifeless. The data from their scans suggested an environment so harsh that life, as they understood it, could not possibly thrive there. But as they landed and began their initial surveys, they discovered something astonishing. Not only was there life on Terramorth, but there were humans. They were not just surviving, they were dominating. The people of Terramorth were unlike any other. Hardened by their environment, their bodies were strong and resilient, their minds sharp and adaptive. They had evolved alongside their hostile world, turning every challenge it threw at them into a lesson in survival. To these people, the storms were teachers, the predators were rivals, and the planet itself was both their greatest adversary and their most steadfast ally. Generations of living in this environment had shaped their culture. On Terramorth, weakness was not scorned but simply could not survive. The laws of nature reigned supreme: adapt or perish, hunt or be hunted. Children learned these rules from the moment they could walk. To them, games were not for entertainment but for honing the skills they would need to survive. A child who stumbled into a pit of thorns would not be rushed to safety. Instead, the elders would watch from a distance, observing how they responded. If the child found a way out, they would grow stronger. If not, it was seen as nature's way of determining who was ready to face the world. When the first alien explorers set foot on Terramorth, they brought with them a dangerous underestimation of its inhabitants. To the aliens, these primitive humans were no threat. They had no advanced technology, no grand cities, no interstellar weapons. But the people of Terramorth had something far more valuable: an unmatched ability to adapt. The aliens' advanced tools and machines were no match for the ingenuity of a people who had learned to turn every aspect of their deadly environment into a weapon. The aliens' first encounters with the Terramorthians ended in disaster. Their high-tech drones were caught in simple yet effective traps. Their scouting parties were ambushed by people who seemed to materialize out of the shadows. The terrain itself became a battlefield, with the locals using their intimate knowledge of the land to outmaneuver and outwit their technologically superior foes. Thus, the legend of the Deathworlders was born. What began as a tale of survival soon became a story of defiance. These were not just people fighting to live, they were warriors proving that even the harshest conditions could forge strength and resilience unmatched in the galaxy. The first encounter with alien mercenaries. The peace of Terramorth's endless struggle was shattered the day the mercenaries arrived. These weren't traders or explorers like the first visitors. No, these were soldiers, bred and trained for conquest, hired by a vast interstellar trade alliance that had set its sights on the planet's untapped resources. To the mercenaries, this was just another contract, another primitive world to be subdued and stripped bare. They didn't expect a challenge. Their massive ship descended onto one of Terramorth's rare open plains, kicking up a storm of dust and debris. Out of its metallic hull poured squads of heavily armed aliens, encased in advanced armor and wielding weapons that shimmered with deadly energy. Their scouting drones hovered above, scanning the land for signs of movement, mapping the terrain as they advanced. To the mercenaries, the planet seemed hostile but uninhabited. A perfect conquest. But from the jagged cliffs overlooking the plains, unseen eyes watched every move they made. The Deathworlders had no technology to rival the invaders, but they didn't need it. They had the land, the instincts honed by a lifetime of survival, and most importantly, they had each other. The mercenaries' first mistake was underestimating their enemy. When a small scouting team ventured into a nearby forest, they expected to gather data, perhaps collect samples, and return unscathed. Instead, they walked into a death trap. Giant rocks rolled down from unseen heights, crushing their armored bodies. Pitfalls lined with sharpened stakes swallowed others whole. When the survivors turned to retreat, they were greeted by a hail of primitive arrows, tipped with bone and poison, finding the weak points in their high-tech suits. Not a single mercenary from that team returned. Back at their ship, the commanders grew uneasy. This was not the easy mission they had signed up for. Every subsequent attempt to push further into the planet's territory met with similar failure. The Deathworlders didn't fight like any enemy the mercenaries had faced before. They struck from the shadows, using the terrain to their advantage. Forests became mazes of ambushes, with paths designed to funnel invaders into traps. Open plains turned into killing fields, with well-hidden warriors striking from afar before vanishing into the ground itself. But what unnerved the mercenaries most wasn't the attacks, it was the silence between them. The Deathworlders never revealed themselves fully. They were ghosts, moving through the jungle without a sound, watching and waiting. At night, the mercenaries huddled together inside their fortified ship, jumping at every rustle of leaves or distant howl. Their sophisticated sensors, designed to detect lifeforms across vast distances, became useless in the face of the planet's sheer hostility. Terramorph itself seemed to conspire against them. One of the mercenary commanders, a hardened veteran named Commander Terrell, decided to escalate the conflict. He ordered the deployment of heavy artillery, targeting a small village that had been spotted through drone surveillance. Massive energy cannons lit up the night sky, reducing the settlement to ash in minutes. For a brief moment, the mercenaries thought they had won. They believed they had sent a message to the Deathworlders. But when the sun rose, it was clear who the real victors were. The mercenaries awoke to find their ship surrounded. Fires burned in the distance, signaling the warriors' presence. The ground beneath their feet felt unstable, and every shadow seemed to conceal danger. The Deathworlders didn't strike immediately. Instead, they let fear and paranoia consume the invaders. Then, when the mercenaries were at their most vulnerable, the Deathworlders attacked. It wasn't an outright assault but a coordinated series of skirmishes designed to disorient and exhaust the enemy. By the end of the day, the mercenaries had lost more than half their forces, and their confidence was shattered. Commander Terrell, now desperate, ordered an emergency evacuation. As the remaining mercenaries scrambled onto their ship, they left behind the dead, the wounded, and any equipment too heavy to carry. The Deathworlders watched from the trees as the ship ascended, leaving the planet with fewer answers than when they arrived. They had come as conquerors, but they left as victims. For the Deathworlders, this victory was just another day on their harsh world. For the mercenaries and their employers, it was a humbling defeat. The Trade Alliance, which had once seen Terramorph as nothing more than a resource-rich prize, now spoke of it in hushed tones. The Deathworlders were no longer an anonymous people on a forgotten planet. They were a force to be reckoned with, a nightmare for anyone foolish enough to challenge them. Thus began the legend of Terramorph as the graveyard of invaders and the home of the galaxy's deadliest survivors. Tactics of survival. For the Deathworlders, survival wasn't just a necessity, it was a way of life. On Terramorph, every day was a battle against an unforgiving world. The dense forests teemed with predators that hunted without mercy. The skies unleashed storms so fierce that they could rip trees from the ground. Even the earth itself held hidden dangers, sinkholes that could swallow a person whole, rivers that could turn into torrents of destruction within minutes, and poisonous plants disguised as harmless greenery. Yet, the people of Terramorph thrived in this chaos. They didn't see their environment as an enemy, but as a teacher. The storms taught them to move swiftly and decisively, the predators honed their instincts, and the unpredictable terrain sharpened their awareness. Over generations, these lessons became the foundation of their survival tactics. Every Deathworlder was trained from childhood to understand the land intimately. They could tell the time by the way the wind shifted or predict a storm by the color of the horizon. They knew which plants could heal and which could kill, and they used this knowledge to craft poisons and medicines alike. Their weapons, though simple in appearance, were masterpieces of functional design. Spears were carved from bones and reinforced with obsidian shards, while bows were strung with fibers taken from the planet's toughest plants. These tools, paired with their deep understanding of the environment, made them far more lethal than any advanced weaponry. What truly set the Deathworlders apart, however, was their ability to use the land itself as a weapon. They didn't just fight with arrows and spears, they fought with the terrain. When the mercenaries invaded, the Deathworlders transformed the forests, plains, and mountains into a battlefield. They used the dense undergrowth to conceal their movements, turned rivers into traps, and lured enemies into narrow passes where ambushes awaited. Traps were one of their most effective tools. A simple pitfall covered with foliage could immobilize an armored mercenary, while heavy boulders placed strategically on cliffs could be sent crashing down to crush an entire patrol. Some traps were ingeniously cruel, such as sharpened stakes coated in plant-based toxins that caused debilitating pain. These traps weren't just tools of destruction, they were messages. To the mercenaries, they screamed, "This land belongs to us. You don't." The Deathworlders also mastered psychological warfare. At night, they used sound to unnerve their enemies. Howls echoed through the forests, whistles mimicked the cries of strange creatures, and the snapping of branches hinted at unseen predators. These sounds weren't random, they were carefully orchestrated to keep the mercenaries awake, paranoid, and on edge. Exhaustion and fear were just as effective as any spear. Teamwork was another hallmark of their survival. The Deathworlders didn't fight alone. Hunting parties worked in perfect harmony, communicating through hand signals and subtle gestures. Each person knew their role, and any mistake was immediately corrected by another. This seamless coordination made them unpredictable and almost impossible to counter. When the mercenaries deployed drones to track the Deathworlders, they found themselves outmatched yet again. The Deathworlders used nets woven from plant fibers to capture the drones or led them into areas where the dense canopy interfered with their signals. They quickly learned to dismantle the drones and repurpose their parts, using them to create new traps or tools. The Deathworlders' adaptability was unparalleled. When the mercenaries upgraded their armor to withstand traditional projectiles, the Deathworlders began targeting weak points like joints and visors. When energy weapons set fire to the forests, they used the smoke to mask their movements. Every time the mercenaries thought they had the upper hand, the Deathworlders evolved their tactics. Their ingenuity was matched only by their determination. For the Deathworlders, every battle was a fight for survival, not just for themselves, but for their families, their land, and their way of life. They fought with a ferocity born from necessity, and their enemies quickly learned that underestimating them was a fatal mistake. The mercenaries, despite their advanced technology, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. Their weapons were powerful but useless against an enemy they couldn't see. Their armor was strong but ineffective against the cunning of warriors who knew how to exploit its flaws. The land itself seemed to rise against them, each tree, rock, and river conspiring to undo their efforts. The Deathworlders didn't just survive, they thrived. They turned the very forces that sought to destroy them into tools of victory. Terramorph was their home, their weapon, and their ally. On this unforgiving planet, the Deathworlders weren't just fighting a war, they were defining what it meant to endure. With every battle, their legend grew. They weren't just survivors of a hostile world, they were masters of it. And as the galaxy watched their victories mount, a question began to spread: if they could defeat such overwhelming odds, what else were they capable of? Weapons of chaos, technology and tactics. The Deathworlders' tools of war were forged not in factories but by necessity. They lacked the sleek technology and advanced weapons of the galaxy's major powers, but what they possessed was something far greater: ingenuity, resourcefulness, and an unparalleled understanding of their environment. To outsiders, their weapons and tactics seemed primitive, but to those who faced them, they were nothing short of terrifyingly effective. The land itself was the Deathworlders' greatest weapon. On Terramorph, every tree, every stone, and every gust of wind became a potential ally in their fight. The dense forests provided natural camouflage, allowing them to move unseen. Rivers, often impassable for the heavily armored mercenaries, became strategic barriers. Even the planet's dangerous storms were used to their advantage, as the Deathworlders timed their attacks to coincide with the chaos of nature. Their physical weapons, though simple in design, were honed to lethal precision. Spears crafted from the bones of Terramorph's predators were as sharp as any blade. Arrows, tipped with poisons extracted from the planet's deadly plants, could pierce even the most advanced armor at its weak points. Slingshots hurled stones with such force and accuracy that they shattered helmets and left enemies dazed. These tools were not just weapons but extensions of the Deathworlders' knowledge of their world. What truly set them apart, however, was their ability to adapt. When mercenaries deployed drones for reconnaissance, the Deathworlders countered with nets woven from the fibers of jungle plants, strong enough to ensnare the machines. When energy shields rendered their arrows less effective, they developed ways to distract and overwhelm the enemy, forcing them into hand-to-hand combat where the Deathworlders' superior physicality and training gave them the upper hand. But their mastery of the environment went beyond weapons. Traps were a cornerstone of their strategy, and they were works of art in their own right. Pitfalls hidden beneath layers of leaves and dirt swallowed entire squads of mercenaries. Deadfalls, triggered by a single misstep, sent boulders crashing down from above. Some traps were designed to maim rather than kill, leaving survivors to spread fear and chaos among their ranks. Their psychological tactics were equally devastating. At night, the Deathworlders used sound to terrorize their enemies. Strange howls echoed through the forests, accompanied by eerie whistles and the rustling of unseen movement. Fires appeared on distant hilltops, only to vanish moments later. These illusions of an omnipresent, invisible force drained the mercenaries of their morale, making them easy prey when the real attacks began. The Deathworlders' coordination was another key to their success. Hunting parties operated like well-oiled machines, each member fulfilling a specific role. Their communication relied on hand signals, clicks, and whistles that blended seamlessly with the natural sounds of the jungle. This allowed them to outmaneuver their enemies with precision, striking and retreating before the mercenaries could organize a proper defense. One of the most feared tactics was their use of controlled chaos. They deliberately created situations where the mercenaries were forced to make snap decisions, often leading to costly mistakes. Fires would be set to drive enemy forces into predetermined kill zones. Diversions were staged to draw attention away from real threats. Even the weather was used against them, with attacks timed to coincide with sudden storms or heavy winds. Despite their reliance on primitive tools, the Deathworlders were far from technologically ignorant. When they captured enemy drones, weapons, or other equipment, they quickly dismantled and studied them, learning their strengths and weaknesses. Over time, they began integrating salvage technology into their arsenal, creating hybrid weapons that combined the raw power of alien tech with their own rugged ingenuity. One such innovation was the use of explosive traps, crafted from salvaged munitions, which they buried beneath the jungle floor to destroy enemy vehicles. The mercenaries, accustomed to fighting enemies with predictable strategies, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer unpredictability of the Deathworlders. Every skirmish felt different, every ambush tailored to exploit their weaknesses. The planet itself seemed to be fighting against them, a sentiment that only deepened their fear and frustration. In one particularly harrowing battle, the mercenaries attempted to secure a narrow mountain pass. The Deathworlders had anticipated this and spent weeks preparing the terrain. As the enemy forces moved through the pass, they triggered a series of traps that caused landslides, blocking their retreat. Boulders rained down from above, crushing vehicles and scattering soldiers. Those who survived the initial onslaught were picked off one by hidden archers, their poisoned arrows finding their marks with unerring accuracy. By the time the battle was over, the pass was littered with wreckage and bodies, a grim testament to the Deathworlders' mastery of their environment. The mercenaries had learned a painful lesson. On Terramorth, the land itself was a weapon, and its people were its masters. The Deathworlders' weapons of chaos were not just tools of war, they were expressions of their resilience and ingenuity. They had turned a world designed to kill into a fortress, and every battle reinforced their legend as the galaxy's most formidable survivors. For the mercenaries, each encounter was a reminder that no amount of technology could replace the raw power of adaptability and determination. And as word of their victories spread, one thing became clear: the Deathworlders weren't just defending their home, they were redefining what it meant to fight, survive, and win. Unlikely alliances. As the battles raged on and the legend of the Deathworlders grew, it became clear to the people of Terramorth that they could not face the galaxy's might alone. Their victories against the mercenaries had proven their strength, but the cost was mounting. Resources were stretched thin, and the relentless onslaught of the Trade Alliance showed no signs of slowing. It was time to look beyond their planet for allies, though the very thought was foreign to a people who had always relied on themselves. The first step toward building alliances came unexpectedly. One day, a small, battered ship entered Terramorth's atmosphere. It wasn't a mercenary vessel or a trade alliance scout, it was a refugee ship, barely holding itself together after what appeared to be a brutal battle. The Deathworlders watched from the shadows as the ship crash-landed in a rocky plain. They approached cautiously, prepared for an ambush, but what they found was something entirely different. Emerging from the ship were a group of alien refugees, their bodies thin and weary, their faces etched with desperation. They were survivors of another world that had fallen victim to the Trade Alliance's relentless expansion. Their home had been destroyed, their people scattered, and now they sought safety wherever they could find it. The Deathworlders, wary of strangers, did not immediately welcome them. The refugees were kept under watch, their every movement observed by silent, unseen eyes. But as the days passed, it became clear that these aliens posed no threat. They were broken, defeated, and in need of hope. One of them, a tall figure with deep blue skin and mournful eyes named Zirin, stepped forward, offering a token of peace, a simple metal insignia, the last remnant of his world's once proud fleet. Zirin spoke of the Trade Alliance's atrocities, of the countless worlds that had fallen to its greed. He didn't ask for pity, he asked for a chance to fight. "We have no home," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "But if you let us stand with you, we can help you protect yours." The Deathworlders, after much deliberation, agreed to let the refugees stay. It was not an easy decision, trusting outsiders went against everything they had learned from their harsh world. Yet, they recognized the value these newcomers brought. The refugees shared information about the Trade Alliance's tactics, ship movements, and weaknesses. In return, the Deathworlders taught them how to survive on Terramorph. The bond was forged not through words, but through mutual need. As news of Terramorph's resistance spread, other groups began to seek them out. Some were fugitives from the Trade Alliance, former mercenaries who had grown disillusioned with their cause. Among them was Ricard, a grizzled soldier who had once led raids on behalf of the Alliance. Haunted by the atrocities he had committed, Ricard sought redemption by offering his skills to the Deathworlders. He provided invaluable insight into the Alliance's military strategies, training the Deathworlders in tactics that could counter advanced technology. Others who arrived were traders and smugglers, drawn by stories of Terramorph's defiance. At first, they came looking for profit, hoping to barter supplies in exchange for rare resources. But as they witnessed the resilience of the Deathworlders, many chose to stay, joining the growing coalition against the Trade Alliance. The most surprising allies came from the very ranks of the Trade Alliance itself. A young commander named Aaron, stationed on a nearby outpost, had grown disillusioned with the Alliance's exploitation of weaker worlds. When he learned of Terramorph's resistance, he defected with a small fleet, offering his ships and resources to the Deathworlders. Though initially met with suspicion, Aaron's defection marked a turning point in the conflict. His fleet gave the coalition its first foothold beyond Terramorph. Despite the growing strength of their alliance, the Deathworlders knew that unity would not come easily. Each new ally brought their own goals, fears, and rivalries. Tensions flared as different groups struggled to work together. The refugees resented the former mercenaries, blaming them for the destruction of their worlds. The smugglers clashed with the disciplined ex-military officers. Even among the Deathworlders themselves, there were debates about how much they should trust these outsiders. The key to holding the alliance together came from Auric, the wise leader of the Deathworlders. In a gathering of the coalition's leaders, he stood before them and spoke plainly. "We are not the same," he said, his voice steady and firm. "We come from different worlds, different lives. But the enemy we face does not care about our differences. To them, we are all tools to be used or discarded. If we do not stand together, we will fall alone." His words resonated deeply, and slowly, the alliance began to coalesce. The Deathworlders' unwavering resolve became a unifying force, inspiring their allies to set aside their differences. Together, they crafted strategies that combined their unique strengths. The refugees shared their technical expertise, the smugglers provided crucial supply lines, and the defectors brought insider knowledge of the Trade Alliance. For the first time, Terramorph's resistance extended beyond its borders. Coordinated strikes began targeting Trade Alliance installations in nearby systems. Supply convoys were ambushed, outposts sabotaged, and key trade routes disrupted. The coalition's attacks were swift, precise, and devastating. The Trade Alliance, which had once viewed Terramorph as a minor nuisance, now found itself facing a growing rebellion. Through their alliances, the Deathworlders transformed their fight from a local struggle into a galactic movement. They proved that even the most isolated and underestimated could rise to challenge the mightiest empires. And as their coalition grew stronger, the galaxy began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the Trade Alliance's reign of terror could finally be brought to an end. When the balance of power shifts. The galaxy had begun to change, and it all started with Terramorph. What was once a forgotten planet on the fringes of space had become the epicenter of a growing rebellion. The Trade Alliance, once thought invincible, now found itself on the defensive, its vast resources stretched thin as it struggled to contain the ripple effects of Terramorph's defiance. Every attack the Deathworlders and their allies launched was a hammer blow to the Alliance's once unshakable dominance. Supply lines were severed, outposts were abandoned, and entire fleets were diverted to protect assets once considered untouchable. The Alliance's enemies were no longer confined to Terramorph. Across the galaxy, oppressed worlds began to rise, inspired by stories of the Deathworlders' defiance. On one such planet, a young farmer named Nira stood before her village, her voice trembling but resolute. "If the Deathworlders can stand against them," she said, "so can we." Her words sparked a fire among her people, and soon, a small insurrection began, striking at the Alliance's garrisons. Nira's story was one of many. Across the galaxy, similar tales unfolded as ordinary people took up arms, fueled by hope and the promise of freedom. Within the Trade Alliance itself, cracks began to form. The once unified leadership grew divided over how to handle the escalating crisis. Some advocated for an all-out assault on Terramorph, calling for the annihilation of the planet to make an example of its defiance. Others argued for negotiation, fearing that such an act of brutality would only further galvanize the rebellion. At the heart of the Alliance's indecision was Darius Maltron, the cold and calculating Supreme Commander. He had built his career on conquest and efficiency, but Terramorph had become his greatest frustration. Sitting in his towering command chamber, he stared at the holographic maps of the galaxy, marked with growing pockets of resistance. "How," he muttered to himself, "can a single planet cause this much chaos?" For the Deathworlders, the shifting tides of power presented both opportunities and challenges. Their victories had earned them allies and admiration, but they also painted a target on their backs. The Trade Alliance was desperate to reclaim its dominance, and Terramorph remained its primary focus. In response, the Deathworlders and their coalition adopted a strategy of misdirection and subterfuge. Instead of defending a single stronghold, they spread their forces across the galaxy. Guerrilla units struck in unexpected places, keeping the Alliance off balance. Former mercenaries like Ricard led small, mobile teams that targeted critical infrastructure, from fuel depots to communications hubs. Smugglers like Zirin provided vital supply lines, slipping past Alliance patrols with practiced ease. One of the most daring operations took place in the heart of an Alliance-controlled system. Using stolen clearance codes, the Coalition infiltrated a high-security space station, disabling its defenses from within and broadcasting a message across the galaxy. It was a simple statement, spoken in dozens of languages: the Trade Alliance's reign is not eternal. Terramorph stands, and so can you. The station was destroyed minutes later, but the message had already spread. The Alliance's retaliation was swift and brutal. They sent an armada to Terramorph, determined to crush the rebellion at its source. The fleet, bristling with advanced weaponry and staffed by seasoned officers, represented the Alliance's full might. But when they arrived in Terramorph's orbit, they found only silence. The Deathworlders had prepared for this moment. Using their intimate knowledge of the planet's terrain, they had lured the Alliance forces into a deadly trap. As the armada descended, it encountered a series of atmospheric disturbances, intentionally triggered by the Deathworlders' manipulation of the planet's volatile weather systems. Electrical storms fried sensors, and sudden wind shifts sent smaller ships crashing into one another. On the ground, the Deathworlders and their allies unleashed a coordinated ambush. Guerrilla fighters struck from hidden bunkers, using salvaged weaponry and homemade explosives to disable tanks and armored transports. Poison traps and camouflaged snipers targeted high-ranking officers, throwing the invading forces into disarray. The final blow came when a group of Deathworlders, led by Kalen, infiltrated the command ship of the Armada. They disabled its central reactor, forcing the fleet to retreat or risk total destruction. As the Alliance ships limped away, the skies over Terramorph erupted in cheers. Against overwhelming odds, the Deathworlders had once again defended their home. But the cost of the battle was high. Villages were left in ruins, and many lives were lost. As the Deathworlders buried their fallen, their leader Auric stood among them, his voice heavy with both sorrow and determination. "We fight not because we want to," he said, "but because we must. Let their sacrifice remind us that freedom is not won, it is defended." The victory on Terramorph sent shockwaves through the galaxy. For the Trade Alliance, it was a humiliation that they could not afford. Planets that had once remained neutral began openly supporting the rebellion. Even within the Alliance's ranks, dissent grew, with more officers questioning the wisdom of continuing the war. The balance of power had shifted. Terramorph was no longer just a battleground, it was a beacon. The Deathworlders had proven that even the smallest and most isolated could stand against the greatest of forces. And as their allies rallied and their legend grew, one thing became clear: this was not the end of the fight. It was only the beginning of a new era, one where the galaxy would no longer bow to fear and greed. For the first time in living memory, the Trade Alliance's grip on the galaxy began to loosen, and the stars themselves seemed to shine a little brighter with the promise of change. The Mercenaries' Dilemma. The mercenaries of the Trade Alliance were known as the finest hired guns in the galaxy. Equipped with state-of-the-art technology and trained in every form of warfare, they were sent into conflicts to overwhelm, intimidate, and conquer. Yet, on Terramorph, all their experience and superiority failed them. What they encountered on this deadly planet wasn't just resistance, it was an unrelenting force that dismantled their confidence piece by piece. Initially, the mercenaries viewed the Deathworlders as a minor challenge. Primitive humans armed with spears and arrows? They had faced far worse. Or so they thought. As their campaigns dragged on, confidence turned into confusion, then into desperation. Every mission sent to Terramorph ended in catastrophe. Teams disappeared without a trace, entire squadrons were caught in elaborate traps, and those who managed to survive returned broken, haunted by what they had seen and fought against. The most unsettling part for the mercenaries wasn't the physical toll but the psychological warfare waged by the Deathworlders. At night, eerie howls echoed through the jungles, accompanied by the faint rustling of unseen movement. The mercenaries' advanced scanners were rendered useless by the dense terrain and environmental interference. Each shadow became a potential threat, each sound a harbinger of attack. Sleep became impossible, paranoia rampant. Commander Terrell, a veteran mercenary with countless victories under his belt, was tasked with leading the largest force yet to Terramorph. Confident in his ability, he promised swift results to the Trade Alliance leadership. His plan relied on overwhelming firepower and brute force, strategies that had served him well in the past. He ordered the deployment of artillery strikes, energy bombardments, and flame units to burn down the dense forests that concealed the Deathworlders. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. Entire sections of jungle were reduced to ashes, and a few hidden villages were destroyed. Terrell declared victory and began consolidating his forces. But what he didn't realize was that he had played directly into the Deathworlders' hands. They had anticipated his tactics and retreated deeper into the planet's interior, drawing his forces into terrain far more treacherous. The Deathworlders counterattacked with devastating precision. Heavy boulders tumbled down from cliffs, crushing vehicles. Arrows laced with toxins incapacitated soldiers, and guerrilla ambushes targeted supply lines, leaving Terrell's forces stranded without food or ammunition. Each day, the mercenaries lost ground, their forces fragmented and demoralized. As the days turned into weeks, Terrell's carefully orchestrated campaign descended into chaos. He realized too late that the Deathworlders weren't merely defending, they were dismantling his army from within. His soldiers, once disciplined and confident, became erratic, jumping at every sound and lashing out at shadows. Supplies dwindled, morale plummeted, and desertion became rampant. One fateful night, Terrell's command post was infiltrated. A small group of Deathworlders slipped past his defenses, leaving no trace except for a crude message etched into the ground outside his tent: "You are not welcome here." Leave, or die. It was both a warning and a declaration of dominance. For Terrell, it was the final blow to his pride. With no reinforcements and his forces in shambles, Terrell was left with no choice but to retreat. He sent an emergency distress signal to the Trade Alliance, requesting immediate extraction. The evacuation was chaotic, as the Deathworlders launched one last series of ambushes on the retreating mercenaries. By the time the surviving forces left Terramorth, they were a shadow of their former selves, defeated, humiliated, and broken. The repercussions of the defeat were immediate and far-reaching. Within the Trade Alliance, the failure of Terrell's campaign shook confidence in their mercenary forces. For decades, the mercenaries had been the Alliance's hammer, their tool of domination. Now, they were seen as fallible, even vulnerable. Recruitment efforts faltered, as fewer soldiers were willing to risk their lives on a planet that had become a graveyard for so many. For the mercenaries themselves, Terramorth became a name whispered with dread. Veterans who had survived spoke of the Deathworlders as ghosts, unstoppable, omnipresent, and terrifyingly intelligent. Some even refused to accept new contracts from the Trade Alliance, citing the horrors they had endured. The Deathworlders, however, saw this victory not as an end but as another step in their ongoing struggle. They knew the Trade Alliance wouldn't give up so easily. But with each battle, their legend grew stronger, their unity deeper, and their resolve unshakable. And as the galaxy watched the once mighty mercenaries crumble, one thing became clear: the era of the Trade Alliance's dominance was coming to an end. Mind over muscle. After countless failed campaigns on Terramorth, the Trade Alliance realized that brute force was not enough to conquer the Deathworlders. The mercenaries, despite their advanced weaponry and superior numbers, had been repeatedly humiliated. The Alliance needed a new strategy, one that would rely not on muscle, but on intellect. Thus began a campaign of psychological and strategic warfare, aimed at breaking the spirit of the Deathworlders. The Alliance's first step was to infiltrate the ranks of the Deathworlders' growing coalition. They dispatched covert operatives disguised as refugees, traitors, or even defectors from the mercenaries. Their mission was to sow discord, gather intelligence, and identify weaknesses. At first, the operatives managed to slip through the cracks, spreading subtle rumors among the coalition. They whispered of hidden betrayals, of allies with ulterior motives, and of internal conflicts brewing beneath the surface. The Deathworlders, however, were not so easily deceived. Their leader, Auric, was quick to notice the signs. When tensions flared between the Deathworlders and their alien allies, Auric called a council. In a quiet but commanding voice, he addressed the coalition: "They seek to divide us because they know they cannot defeat us united. But we are stronger than their lies. Trust is our greatest weapon. We cannot let them take it from us." His words resonated deeply, and the coalition stood firm. Those suspected of treachery were quietly observed, their actions monitored. When evidence of sabotage surfaced, the operatives were exposed and dealt with swiftly. The Alliance's first attempt to destabilize the coalition had failed. Undeterred, the Alliance shifted its focus to the battlefield. They began deploying experimental drones, equipped with cloaking technology and advanced AI, to surveil Terramorth and its defenders. These drones operated silently, gathering data on Deathworlder movements, supply routes, and strongholds. The Alliance hoped to use this intelligence to launch precision strikes that would cripple the Deathworlders' defenses. But once again, the Deathworlders proved their adaptability. Kaelin, a young but brilliant tactician, devised a countermeasure. Using captured technology from previous battles, she and her team created decoys, false encampments filled with heat signatures and movement patterns designed to mimic real settlements. When the Alliance targeted these decoys, they wasted precious resources on empty terrain while exposing their own positions to counterattacks. The Deathworlders also waged their own psychological war. They launched coordinated raids deep into Alliance-controlled territory, striking supply depots, communication hubs, and even high-security installations. These attacks were swift and devastating, leaving behind minimal casualties but maximum destruction. The Alliance's forces were left scrambling to recover, their morale shaken by an enemy that seemed to strike from nowhere. One of the most audacious moves came when a team of Deathworlders infiltrated an Alliance command station. Led by Ricard, the former mercenary turned ally, the team disabled critical systems and broadcast a message to the galaxy: your chains are only as strong as your fear. Stand up, and they will break. The station was destroyed shortly after, but the message had already spread, igniting new flames of rebellion across the galaxy. The Alliance grew increasingly desperate. Supreme Commander Darius Maltron, a man who prided himself on his strategic brilliance, convened an emergency council. "We are not losing to their weapons," he admitted, his voice cold and sharp. "We are losing to their minds. They anticipate our every move. They turn our strength into weakness. If we are to defeat them, we must think like them." Maltron's words led to the development of a new plan. The Alliance began deploying harvesters, massive machines designed to strip entire regions of Terramorph of their natural resources. The goal was twofold: to deprive the Deathworlders of the land they relied on and to force them into the open. It was a cruel strategy, one that threatened not only the Deathworlders but the delicate balance of Terramorph's ecosystem. But the Deathworlders had long since learned to turn adversity into advantage. When the harvesters descended, they didn't retreat. Instead, they attacked with relentless ferocity, targeting the machine's weak points and using their size against them. In one battle, Zirin, the alien refugee-turned-strategist, devised a trap that lured a harvester into a volcanic ravine. The ground beneath it gave way, and the massive machine plunged into molten rock, consumed by the planet it sought to exploit. The war of minds continued to escalate, but the Deathworlders remained a step ahead. They understood that the Alliance's greatest weapon was fear, not just the fear they inflicted, but the fear they themselves carried. The Deathworlders exploited this, creating illusions of an unstoppable force. Fires would appear on distant hilltops, shapes would move in the shadows, and whispers would spread among Alliance soldiers of an enemy that could not be defeated. The psychological toll on the Alliance was immense. Soldiers began to desert in increasing numbers, unable to endure the constant pressure. Commanders found their orders questioned, their authority undermined by the creeping doubt that perhaps the Deathworlders truly were invincible. For the Deathworlders, this war was more than a battle for survival. It was a battle of wills, a test of their ability to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast a vastly superior enemy. Each victory, no matter how small, was a testament to their resilience. Each defeat for the Alliance was another crack in their facade of invincibility. As the war dragged on, one thing became clear: the Deathworlders were not just survivors of a hostile world. They were masters of it. Their minds, sharpened by years of struggle, had become their most formidable weapon. And in a galaxy where strength had always been measured in numbers and technology, the Deathworlders were rewriting the rules of power. The rise of a legend. By now, the name Deathworlders was spoken in hushed tones across the galaxy. For some, it was a name that inspired hope; for others, a reminder of failure and humiliation. What had begun as a local struggle to defend a harsh world had transformed into a movement that challenged the very fabric of galactic dominance. The Deathworlders were no longer just warriors of Terramorph; they were a symbol of resilience, defiance, and the indomitable will to survive. The legend of the Deathworlders spread like wildfire, carried by traders, refugees, and defectors who had witnessed their strength firsthand. On countless planets, stories were told of warriors who could turn the deadliest environment into their greatest ally, of people who faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. These stories inspired revolts on worlds long oppressed by the Trade Alliance. On one mining colony, a young worker named Aaron led an uprising against their overseers after hearing of the Deathworlders' victories. "If they can fight, so can we," became a rallying cry for countless others. For the Trade Alliance, this rising tide of rebellion was catastrophic. Each defeat on Terramorph chipped away at their authority, emboldening their enemies and fracturing their alliances. Within the Alliance's inner council, bitter arguments erupted over how to respond. Supreme Commander Darius Maltron pushed for a final, decisive strike to crush Terramorph once and for all, but others warned that such an act could backfire, galvanizing the rebellion even further. Meanwhile, on Terramorph, the Deathworlders were becoming increasingly aware of the growing weight of their legend. For years, they had fought to protect their home. Now, they found themselves leading a galaxy-wide resistance. It was a responsibility they did not take lightly. In a council meeting of their coalition, Auric, the elder leader of the Deathworlders, addressed the gathered representatives of their allies. "We are not gods or invincible warriors," he said, his voice steady. "We are survivors, like all of you. But if our struggle has taught us anything, it is that survival depends on unity, on trust, and on the will to endure. Let our story remind the galaxy that no empire, no matter how powerful, is eternal." Auric's words resonated deeply, and the coalition grew stronger. Each ally brought unique skills and resources to the fight. The refugees who had fled to Terramorph became its greatest diplomats, spreading its message to other oppressed worlds. Former mercenaries like Ricard trained new recruits, teaching them the tactics that had been used to dismantle the Trade Alliance's forces. Zirin, the alien strategist, coordinated attacks across multiple systems, ensuring that every strike delivered maximum impact. The Deathworlders also began venturing beyond their home planet, carrying the fight to the Trade Alliance. Using salvaged ships and technology, they launched daring raids on Alliance installations, disrupting supply lines and crippling key infrastructure. One such mission, led by Kaelin, targeted a heavily fortified weapons depot. Against all odds, her team infiltrated the facility, disabled its defenses, and escaped with vital supplies, delivering a major blow to the Alliance's military capabilities. But with every victory came new challenges. The Deathworlders' growing influence made them a target not only for the Trade Alliance but also for other galactic powers who feared the spread of their ideals. Some saw them as a destabilizing force, while others sought to exploit their fame for their own gain. The Deathworlders found themselves navigating a complex web of politics and alliances, even as they prepared for the battles to come. Their legend continued to grow, taking on a life of its own. On distant worlds, children played at being Deathworlders, crafting wooden spears and pretending to ambush imaginary mercenaries. Songs were written about their victories, and their story was immortalized in murals and tapestries. For many, the Deathworlders were no longer just a people, they were an idea, a symbol of resistance that could never be extinguished. But the Deathworlders themselves remained grounded. Despite their growing fame, they never lost sight of what they were fighting for. Terramorph was their home, a place where survival was earned every day. They knew that their victories were not just a testament to their strength, but to their unity, their ingenuity, and their unbreakable spirit. In one of the rare moments of peace on Terramorph, Auric stood atop a ridge overlooking the jungles and mountains of his home. Beside him was Kaelin, the young tactician who had become one of the Coalition's brightest leaders. "Do you think this will ever end?" she asked, her voice tinged with both hope and doubt. Auric's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "The fight may end, but the struggle never will. Freedom isn't something you win once, it's something you defend every day. That is the lesson Terramorph has taught us." Kaelin nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we'll make sure the galaxy learns it too." And so, the Deathworlders continued their fight, not just for Terramorph, but for every world that yearned to be free. Their legend burned brighter with each passing day, a beacon of hope for the oppressed and a warning to the powerful. In the vast expanse of the galaxy, the Deathworlders proved that even the smallest spark could ignite a fire strong enough to change the stars themselves. After the storm, the Trade Alliance was broken. Its fleets, once symbols of unstoppable power, now floated in fragmented ruins across the galaxy. Its leaders, once feared, were now fugitives, hunted by the very people they had sought to dominate. What had been an empire built on greed and exploitation crumbled, piece by piece, under the relentless pressure of rebellion. At the heart of this transformation stood the Deathworlders of Terramorph, a people who had defied all odds and inspired the galaxy to fight for its freedom. For the Deathworlders, victory brought little celebration. Their home, though defended, bore the scars of war. Entire regions were scorched from battles, villages were in ruins, and the ecosystem, Terramorph's greatest weapon, needed time to heal. Yet, amidst the destruction, hope blossomed. The Deathworlders worked tirelessly to rebuild, planting trees, restoring rivers, and constructing homes. To them, rebuilding was not just a duty, it was a testament to their resilience and the unyielding bond they shared with their world. Beyond Terramorph, the galaxy began to reshape itself. Worlds that had suffered under the Trade Alliance's yoke declared their independence. New governments rose, built on principles of cooperation rather than domination. A fragile but promising era of unity emerged, fueled by the shared sacrifices of countless peoples. The Deathworlders, once an isolated tribe on a forgotten planet, now found themselves at the center of this new galactic order. Delegates from dozens of worlds traveled to Terramorph, seeking guidance, support, and alliances. For many, the Deathworlders were not just allies, they were symbols of what could be achieved through courage and determination. Yet, with their newfound influence came challenges. The Deathworlders were wary of becoming the very thing they had fought against. In a council held atop Terramorph's highest peak, Auric, the elder leader, addressed the coalition of allies who had gathered. "We have fought to defend our home, not to conquer others," Auric said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "We will not impose our will on the galaxy. Our strength lies in unity, not dominance. Let Terramorph be a reminder of what can be achieved when people stand together, not an example of a new power to fear." The Council agreed to form a loose alliance of free worlds, one that valued cooperation and mutual respect over central authority. The Deathworlders played a guiding role, sharing their knowledge of survival, strategy, and resilience. But they refused to claim leadership, believing that no single power should dominate the galaxy. Meanwhile, individuals from Terramorph began venturing into the stars. Warriors became ambassadors, sharing their story with distant worlds. Hunters and tacticians joined liberation movements on planets still struggling for freedom. Scientists, inspired by their planet's unique environment, worked with alien researchers to develop solutions for restoring ecosystems ravaged by war. Each Deathworlder carried the spirit of their home with them, spreading its lessons far and wide. Despite the peace that began to take hold, the Deathworlders knew that the galaxy's balance was fragile. Other powers still lurked in the shadows, some viewing the collapse of the Trade Alliance as an opportunity to expand their own influence. The Deathworlders prepared themselves for the possibility of future conflicts, vowing to remain vigilant. One of the most poignant moments of this new era came when a group of Deathworlders, led by Kalen, traveled to a distant world that had suffered under the Trade Alliance. The planet's surface was barren, its cities reduced to rubble. Yet, the people who remained greeted the Deathworlders not with despair, but with hope. "We heard your story," a young woman from the planet said, her voice trembling. "You showed us that even the smallest can stand against the strongest. You gave us the courage to fight." Kalen placed a hand on the woman's shoulder, her eyes filled with determination. "The fight doesn't end when the war is over. Rebuilding, healing, protecting, that is the real challenge. But you're not alone. None of us are." Back on Terramorph, Auric reflected on all that had been achieved. Standing at the edge of a restored forest, he watched as children, both Deathworlders and the children of refugees, played together, their laughter echoing through the trees. Beside him stood Ricard, the former mercenary who had found redemption among the Deathworlders. "Do you think we've done enough?" Ricard asked, his voice heavy with lingering guilt from his past. Auric smiled faintly, his gaze never leaving the children. "Enough? Perhaps not. But we've done what we could. And that is all anyone can ask." Terramorph's skies, once filled with the smoke of battle, were now clear, revealing countless stars above. For the Deathworlders, those stars represented both a future to protect and a past to honor. Their story, born in the crucible of a deadly world, had become a beacon for the galaxy, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always hope. The Deathworlders were no longer just survivors. They were builders, protectors, and dreamers. And though the wars had ended, their mission continued, to ensure that freedom, hard-won and precious, would endure for generations to come.